Happy New Year from all the team at Levant TV and welcome to the first edition of Press Review for 2014 with me, Carmen. Today we'll be continuing coverage of the Syria crisis as we're joined by analyst Nidal Naissa. We'll also take a look at instability in Egypt following the crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood. But first, let's take a look at the front pages here in the UK. The Guardian front page leads its news with a report on the NHS. An open letter from healthcare leaders calls for a more measured view of how service is performing. The Guardian also takes a look at domestic violence in an article headlined "Inside Court 6, the Cauldron of Domestic Violence." The Independent's front page features a report that blames the government for the accident and emergency crisis. A senior emergency doctor states that warnings about shortages were ignored by ministers. The Independent's front page also features a picture of the New Year's celebrations from Hong Kong Victoria Harbour. Finally, the Daily Telegraph leads its front page news with a story on non-EU citizens who will be able to work in Britain after the Bulgarian restrictions are lifted. The Telegraph front page also features a picture of Big Ben showing New Year's celebrations in London. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. As the Syria crisis continues, let's take a look at what the papers are saying about developments in the region. Ahmed Orabi Baj writes an opinion piece in the Syria Times headline "Geneva 2 Combating Terrorism." Here Baj argues that Geneva 2 will not succeed as long as America is supporting terrorism. Baj claims that he is not surprised that the opposition delegation to the Geneva 2 conference will be composed of armed terrorist factions which are recently formed by the Wahhabi kingdom with the guidance of the US master. Baj points out that Russian and US ministers have agreed that the title of the Geneva 2 conference must be Combating Terrorism. However, he indicates that some armed terrorist groups in Syria announced many weeks ago the formation of a new armed component. Of course, this new faction, which is funded directly by Saudi Arabia, begins to fight the other terrorist organisations. Baj believes as a result of the US seeking to hinder the convening of the Geneva 2 conference, even though it did not declare this frankly. Baj stresses that the US plan has become obvious for all. It will abandon some countries that have provisional roles in order to extricate itself from the accusation of supporting the terrorism. In addition, the US will put the responsibility of supporting terrorism on those countries, especially Saudi Arabia. To conclude, Baj states that the US and its allies are mercenaries, have failed in achieving their sinister and terrorist goals in Syria, and the Syrian Arab Army will continue to eliminate what remains of the Wahhabi Takfiri terrorist groups from all the Syrian territories. The World Socialist website features an article headlined "Terror Bombings Kill at least 32 in Southern Russia," in which Bill Van Auken looks at the recent bombings in the Russian city of Volgograd. Auken claims that the bombings have created the suspicion that the US-backed countries such as Saudi Arabia are revenging against President Putin for not letting the Syrian president alone, observers and analysts said. Auken points out that speculation in the Russian press that the latest terror attacks are the work of US-backed regimes in the Middle East in retaliation for Moscow's diplomatic success in diverting Washington from a direct military intervention to topple the government of President Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Auken added that as President Putin had previously warned, the return of 400 Russian terrorists who were fighting in Syria during the past years can bring terrorism inside the country. Auken also said that these events happened just before the Winter Olympic Games, renewed the attention to the discussion of Putin and former Saudi intelligence chief Bandar bin Sultan, who is one of the main supporters of rebels in Syria. Auken finally concluded that the explosions has raised the question whether Saudi Arabia is sponsoring the North Caucasus terrorists independently or in collaboration with the US, who both want to take revenge on Russia for their defeats in the Syrian war. The American National Public Radio features an interview with Morgan Marquis-Bois, a security researcher at the University of Toronto, by Robert Siegel in an article headlined "In Syria, Conflict in Cyberspace Complements Ground War." Marquis-Bois claims that the Syrian civil war is raging on the battleground, but also raging online. While the rebels have gone online to recruit fighters and coordinate with allies, forces supporting Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime have employed malware to infiltrate and track them. Marquis Bois points out that the malware that is installed generally takes the form of remote access toolkits, so this allows a government attacker pretty much full access to a victim's computer. So in addition to allowing access to their files, it allows the recording of their online communications. When asked what methods hackers use to get their malware to their target, Marquis Bois said that frequently this has actually taken the form of what we would describe as social engineering, which is when you attempt to use some form of trickery in order to present yourself as a legitimate actor to someone in order to get them to trust you and therefore install software. To conclude, Marquis Bois points out that recently there was actions by the hacktivist group Anonymous which involved the infiltration of at least 12 Syrian government websites. The hacktivist collective Telecomics discovered and publicised how the Syrian government's mass surveillance and censorship apparatus performed, and they exposed this to the Wall Street Journal. Joining us today on the show is political analyst Nidal Naisseh. Thank you for joining us, Nidal. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening.
Good evening. Writing for the Syria Times, Ahmed Arabi Baj says that the US is seeking to hinder the convening of Geneva II. Why do you believe this is the case?
Good evening to you all. Well, I do think that Mr. Arabi is quite right, since he is close to Syrian political and information circles, and since that the goals and directions of Syrian file have been changed contrary to America's inspiration, interests, and dream. The goals and agenda of Geneva II is not to topple or overthrow, to topple down or overthrow President Assad or changing the regime as it had been known for the last 3 years, but to fight terrorism, backed mainly very sadly by US friends and the so-called Syrian friends. This is very embarrassing for the United States to reach to this end and termination.
Yeah, and some analysts claim that America considers sitting on the same negotiating table with the Iranians to find a political solution to end the conflict and bloodshed in Syria a failure and defeat on the American side. Why do you think this is?
Well, excuse me, exactly. I think, as I have said before right now, that after 3 years of denying any Iranian role, not only in Syrian file, but rather in the whole region, and the Syrian friends, between two commas, as we know them, the United States and its allies, have been trying to isolate Iran for a long time. It would be very hard and tough for Americans to retract and give up at this point, as well as for American friends in the Persian Gulf sheikdoms to confess that Iran is a part of the solution in Syria or in a major file in the region, while they kept saying for a long time that Iran is part of the problem. It's very embarrassing for them, I do think. They won't accept that so easily.
Yeah, and also some analysts are claiming that Saudi had a hand in the Russia bombings recently. Why do you think this is?
Well, excuse me, as you remember, and as it has been leaked from Prince Bandar last August's visit to Moscow and his meeting with the President Putin, it has been said that Bandar pledged to guarantee and that the Chechenian terrorists will not commit any terrorist operation in Sochi next February. This was widely spread in media. It means that Prince Bandar and the Saudis have control over these dangerous groups, and they can control them very well. This is at first. The second thing is that Saudi Arabia and other Persian Gulf sheikdoms are the main sponsor of sectarian hatred. This is I'm saying literal words and sentences came in the independent, the British the British newspaper, that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Sheikdoms are main sponsors of sectarian hatred and backing terrorist groups in the world. That's that occurred or have been published in the Independent 2 days ago, and I think you may have read that 2 days ago.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us, Nidal.
Thank you very much.
Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening.
As unrest continues in Egypt, let's see what analysts are saying about recent crackdowns on the Muslim Brotherhood. Ali Ibrahim has written an opinion piece for Ash-Sharq al-Awsat titled "Egypt Hits a Bump in the Road." Ibrahim writes, Amma Musa has been one of those Arab politicians who are brilliant at coining expressions and remarks that widely resonate across the Arab world and attract media attention. Regarding Egypt's post-revolution state, he writes, predictions that Egypt could quickly become following the transition a modern state built on modern foundations proved inaccurate and unrealistic. It became clear that major social transformations are often accompanied by troubles and need time to work themselves out. This is not to mention that there are no magical solutions for problems that have been accumulating over decades. Ibrahim sees two main factors as causing Egypt's bump in the road. He writes, first, no one predicted the former regime would fall that quickly. Therefore, without a working plan for the post-Mubarak Egypt, those in charge of the Egyptian state had to improvise and deal with events on a day-to-day basis. He adds, secondly, unlike other major revolutions in history, the Egyptian uprising lacked the leadership that enjoys an authentic intellectual vision. This has perhaps been a key feature of the many public uprisings that have taken place in and out of the region since 2011. He adds, however, the most significant factor behind much of the chaos was the hijacking of the revolution by the Muslim Brotherhood, the most organised political force in Egypt. After realising this was not the change they were after, the Egyptian people revolted against the Brotherhood on June 30th, 2013. Ibrahim sees that the Brotherhood's rule ended after 1 year due not only to their poor performance in government, but also the growing concern of a wide segment of society over the identity of Egypt and the social contract between the government and citizens, particularly in the light of the slogans Islamists have adopted. Therefore, the Brotherhood lost its support among Egyptians, or at least a considerable number of them, who were ready to give the Islamist group another chance. He concludes, today, as we approach 2014, Egypt can overcome the current crisis by putting the political roadmap into effect. The first step to this began with preparing the new draft constitution, which will be put to public referendum in 2 weeks, adding that the public vote will be the first real test of the feasibility of Egypt's return to relative stability, and that Egyptians should be realistic in their predictions. Sarah Lee Whitson, the Middle East and North Africa Director at the Human Rights Watch, has written an analysis for Middle East Voices titled "The Government Cracks Down and Egypt Shrugs." She says the situation now is a national shrug towards brutal attacks now that they're directed against the Muslim Brotherhood and its supporters. There is little popular demand for justice and little prospect for accountability. If Egypt's military-backed government can get away with killing more than 1,000 protesters in broad daylight in 2013, what has really changed since the days of Hosni Mubarak? Whitson writes that the new government has failed to form a fact-finding commission to investigate the massacre of protesters, while Egypt's track record on accountability for the slayings of protesters since the revolution has been dismal. Even investigations into the deaths of protesters at the hands of Mubarak's forces at a time when accountability was a national rallying cry resulted in only slap-on-the-wrist sentences for a few low-level police officers. She adds the military authorities have brazenly disappeared 5 key Morsi advisors, detaining them in secret places without charge for more than 5 months. Many senior Brotherhood figures are held in solitary confinement and report that they are sleeping on the floor in dank cells and are forced to defecate in holes in their cells. She adds, in this context, it's startling to hear Secretary of State John Kerry lauding Egypt's new rulers for restoring democracy while charging the Brotherhood with stealing the revolution. She quotes someone as saying the situation in Egypt today as proof that Egyptians aren't opposed to oppression. They're okay with it as long as they're not the ones being oppressed. The article concludes Egypt's test today is to prove him wrong and show that Egyptians stand against the abuse of any of their fellow citizens, even their political opponents. Daniel Wagner and Giorgio Caffiero have written a piece for the Huffington Post titled "Can Qatar Regain Influence in Egypt?" The authors write, last month hundreds of Egyptians burned Qatari flags outside Doha's embassy in Cairo to protest Qatar's alleged interference in Egypt's affairs, in spite of the $8 billion in foreign aid Qatar loaned to Egypt during Mohamed Morsi's presidency. According to the authors, many of the Muslim Brotherhood's opponents perceived the assistance not as aid for Egypt's moribund economy, but rather as political support for the Brotherhood. Indeed, Doha's relationship with Brotherhood affiliates in Egypt, Libya, Palestine, Syria and Tunisia has earned it a reputation for being one of the organisation's primary state sponsors, provoking further anti-Qatar demonstrations across the Arab world. The authors add that while for many years these three states have viewed the MB as a threat to each ruling kingdom's legitimacy, Morsi's fall eased concerns about the future direction of the Arab Spring from these counter-revolutionary states' vantage point. The UAE's foreign minister hailed Egypt's military as a strong shield and protector of Egypt that will help the country reach a safe and prosperous future. The authors write, according to Qatar's news agency, Qatar's head of state sent a cable of congratulations to Egypt's interim President Mansour. Qatar's government stated that it respects the will of Egypt and its people across the spectrum. The authors add that nearly 3 years after Mubarak was removed from power, Egypt has become a battleground among regional actors, with geopolitical and economic stakes in Egypt's future. It is within the context of Egypt's desperation for money from abroad that foreign aid remains highly influential in Egyptian politics. This enabled Qatar to gain significant influence in Egypt in 2012 and has greatly complicated its relationship with Cairo ever since. The authors conclude, Qatar therefore has potential to retain influence in post-Morsi Egypt as the new government knows what is ultimately in its longer-term economic interest. This must be weighed against the political price that the Egyptian government would pay by once again accepting money from Doha. At that point, Qatar will need to decide if it wishes to provide funds without political strings attached. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. The New York Times front page leads its news with the headline, "Old rivalries reignited a fuse in South Sudan." The Gulf News leads its front page with the headline, "UAE welcomes 2014 with record fireworks." Finally, the Australian's front page leads its news with the headline, "Hawke, Keating advised PM to slash spending." For more updates, please visit levant.tv. Goodbye for now.